Welcome everybody to this Better Brains for Babies webinar. As you can see, Better Brains for Babies is a collaborative project funded by the Georgia Division of Family and Children's Services to teach people about brain development. And we're so excited to have Sharon Murphy here today to talk about Light Up Your Baby's Brain through language, play, and engagement. I will let her share a little bit more about who she is as appropriate. Sharon, take it away. And again, if people have questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat box or hold them to the end, and we will make sure that we do our best to answer all of them at that point. Thanks so much, Sharon. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you this morning talking about a topic that, of course, is very important and hopefully that we are all quite passionate about as we support the growth and development of young children and particularly babies, as we will be talking about today. Currently, just to let you know a little bit about my background, I'm an instructor in the Early Childhood Care and Education Department or program at Gwinnett Technical College. And I also have the privilege of serving and working as a Better Brains advocate and community outreach educator. I hope that you walk away today with some new ideas or fresh ideas. So whether you have a foundation of what you are trying to build upon, or perhaps you have been through some brain development training through Better Brains or otherwise, that you also walk away with information that empowers you to be highly effective and intentional in working with infants. So let's get started. Our session objectives in terms of what we are going to achieve over the next 60 minutes are these three things. One, we will describe the relationship between brain development and language skill acquisition. Two, explain how intentional language engagement supports infants' holistic development, and explore strategies to actively engage infants in meaningful language experience. To start, we're going to look at a few brain basics. The first one that we want to look at is making connections. The fundamental information here is that we want to talk about neurons, and neurons are brain cells. They're the basic cells of the brain and are responsible for all the major functions that happen in our body. Every function of the brain happens because of the communication among the neurons. So you can think of neurons as a network within the brain. Just as we as people network with other people, that's the job of the neurons in the brain, is to network with each other. It's responsible, again, for so many different functions. We can think about talking, laughing, what we feel, what we think. This all comes from the functioning of the electrical signals that are sent through neurons. And as these neurons talk and network with each other, essentially they are building connections with each other to make up the wiring of the brain. The brain then physically grows as the connections are made. It is primarily experience that influences the creation of these connections. So we know that experience matters, and we want to take a look at how it matters and what we can do in order to influence such connections among infants, which leads us to the second one. Oops, I went a little bit too far. Excuse me. Which is brain basic number 2, which is early experiences for young children. So as we said, the brain has to have experiences to develop. It is thought that approximately around the age of 8 months of experiences, after having experiences for that period of time, an infant may already have up to about 1,000 trillion connections created. So we can pause and think about that for just a moment, that we know that they're born with about 100 billion, but about after 8 months of experience, they may have up to 1,000 trillion connections. Because the brain adapts to the environment that it is exposed to, it will make connections based on either repeated negative experiences or repeated positive experiences. So what this is telling us is that the human brain adapts to what it is exposed to. So what we put in will greatly impact the connections that are made for infants and for young children. Specifically, if we think about negative experiences, such as neglect or lack of responsiveness for an infant. That will be wired into the brain, and that is what the brain will adapt to. For positive experiences, which of course is what we want for infants, we can think of loving and nurturing interactions that adults and caregivers and parents are interacting with them beyond their basic needs to create positive experiences that are ongoing. On the slide here you will see the last point, which is the brain is pattern seeking. And this is a direct quote from Dr. Becky Bailey. She is the author and founder of Conscious Discipline, which is all stemmed from brain development. But this is a general principle that we know at large about how the brain develops, that the brain looks for the pattern. So going back to negative and positive experiences, that if an infant, let's say over the course of that 8 months, is exposed to repeated negative experiences, then that's the pattern that it will look for, the pattern that it will achieve. Conversely, again, what we would want is positive experiences. If the infant on a consistent basis is receiving positive interactions, then that's what the brain will look for. That is what the brain has been wired. So therefore, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, the brain again adapts and looks for that pattern. So as caregivers, as parents, and as adults in general, we want to make sure that we are establishing the right pattern, or the healthy pattern, should I say, for young infants. Our next brain basic, number 3, is connections create abilities. So let's talk about that one for just a minute in terms of how that might happen and what that might look like. The brain develops through a use it or lose it, which is probably a quote or a principle that many of you have heard of before. As it operates on this use it or lose it system or process, connections that are frequently used are retained. Other connections that are not repeatedly used will be pruned or eliminated so that the active connections can become stronger. Abilities are developed through this process. So children need lots of opportunities and experiences that are hands-on, that they are authentic for them, and that we're giving them real, meaning that we're giving them real objects to interact with. This is the way that strong connections and abilities are best developed. Let's look a little bit further at this process of what we call pruning, or sometimes you might hear it labeled refining connections. If we think about this process of pruning as a plant, many of you on the line today might pardon, or some may not, but we probably can all relate to this, that we know that a plant has many different basic needs, such as water and sun. That if we go buy this plant, or we get it from a nursery or a neighbor, whoever it might be, we know that we want to foster the plant to be healthy. So we're going to ensure that its essential needs are met. Over time, hopefully it will grow and it will thrive. But after a long period of time of doing so, we know that within the plant, the roots will start to grow, of course, but then they also start to overlap and they become entangled with one another. And we know that we have to do something about this, right? So with a plant, essentially what we do is we would typically repot it. We would put it in a bigger pot to give it more space to go. We will prune it. We'll cut off some unnecessary parts that seem to be dying or that we don't deem necessary for the plant to continue to grow and to be healthy. If we take this and think about a brain, it's the same thing. So going back to the beginning of those connections, if we think about those such as roots within the brain, this is how the process of pruning occurs. With a plant, we can repot it. But with our brains, we know that we just get one, and there isn't anywhere else for it to go. So there's a natural system that is set in place in which the brain will prune what it deems as unnecessary connections. Okay? So if we look at that just a little bit further, there are a few points for us to know that this is necessary. So just like the plant, if we want it to continue to grow and to thrive, we are going to have to repot it. We're going to have to prune it by cutting it back some so that it can continue to do so. Within the brain, again, what it's going to do, and this is automatic and very necessary to help the brain to be efficient, it's going to eliminate unused connections. While we know that this is a good thing for the brain, however, it can be detrimental if it is pruning off connections for important skills. The one thing to know about this, though, is that if these skills or connections are cut off, it doesn't mean that they cannot ever grow again. So for example, if we take an infant who is not necessarily spoken to a lot or read to a lot, all of those language skills, those connections are going to be weak. So therefore, through the natural pruning process, since those are weaker connections, those might go away. But it's not to say that the infant will no longer be able, of course, to acquire language or have stronger language skills. It just means that those connections, again, might be weaker, and it might take longer for an infant or a young child in many cases to gain those skills, or perhaps it might be outside of what we call the window of opportunity for an infant or for a young child. And we know that certain skills are best learned within that window of opportunity. So again, it's not that they won't be able to learn those skills, but we definitely want to take advantage of those optimal learning periods for young children. And again, let's go back to that initial screen. We really want to think about it as a use it or lose it. So in essence, in terms of connections, creating those abilities and what we know about pruning, we want to ensure that we are actively engaging with infants to make those connections that are not only necessary but very important for their growth and development, not just now, but also down the road, that they are strong because they are frequently used and they will be retained within the brain. Now we'll move on to our fourth brain basic, which is supportive interactions. So as I already mentioned, as we're talking about connections within the brain that come from those neurons networking and speaking with each other, there are many different principles that we want to keep in mind. It's not just that we're interacting, but we want to make sure that they are supportive, and we want to make sure that they are intentional to truly support their growth and their development. So we want to go above and beyond meeting their basic needs, of course. So if we start with the first one that is listed there, that infants need parents and caregivers who intentionally go beyond meeting their basic needs, we can think about this from a theoretical perspective as well. If you will, if you think about a pyramid that is three-tiered, and at the bottom of that pyramid you have safety. The next level you have security, and then at the top you have exploration and identity. That infants need their basic care needs to be met, of course, but we know that it goes much further than that to really promote healthy growth and development for them. And at the bottom of that pyramid, I mentioned that there would be safety. That children need to feel as though that their needs will, or infants, that their basic needs will be met, and that other needs that they have will be met as well. This helps them to feel that this is a world that I can trust, that my needs will be met. And that comes from being around adults who are responsive and supportive and nurturing in their interactions with the world. Safety, again, is that bottom place. That's that bottom level of that pyramid. That if we don't have that, children aren't going to progress up that pyramid. When they feel safe, then they feel secure. When they feel secure, then they're able to explore, and that moves them into their identity. This is true for infants, but it works across the board for young children, adolescents, and even as adults. But at times, if we don't feel safe, if we don't feel secure, we will not thrive in the best manner. So we know that that is optimal. And we know that, again, it impacts infants for now, meaning in that present time, but also as they're moving forward, and will affect their latter development and learning throughout their lifetime. So this brings us down to the bottom point of that early adult-child interactions form attachment, which is a word and concept that probably many of you are familiar with or who have heard about. But let's just talk a little bit about attachment and what that means and what that looks like. Attachment begins prenatally when an unborn infant becomes accustomed to the touch, sight, sounds, and smells of her mother or primary caregiver. Newborn infants can recognize their mother's voice and smell based on a prenatal experience, because we know that the wiring of the brain and connections are made prenatally. Daily interactions with adults shape an infant's expectations about how adults behave and guide her responses to the adult's behavior. Infants who adults are reliable and nurturing learn to trust to take care of them. This trust is the foundation of a secure attachment. And we know lots of things about children who are attached. One is that secure infants are happier. And additionally, we know about attachment that humans can attach to more than one person. So a lot of times we talk about attachment with the mother, but the great thing is that it's not just the mother. It's those that are constantly within the life of the infant. Other facts about securely attached infants. You can see a list here. One is that they view the world as trustworthy. They better regulate stress responses. Typically, they're more independent at 18 months. They're better problem solvers at age 2. They are more successful with friendships, and they perform better academically. Specifically, I'd like to make a few other key points, which are that attached children typically have less stress reactivity. What that means is that a securely attached child tends to have a less extreme reaction to stressors. Stressors are a part of life. We know there's positive stress and there is toxic stress. But because a child or an infant is confident that adults will take care of her, her body releases less cortisol under stress, and she is less likely to react to mild stressors, such as having to wait for a short period for her bottle or for his or her diaper to be changed. Again, that shouldn't be a long, extended period of time, but there might be short periods of time where infants have to wait. And that is perfectly okay. That's what we would consider a mild stressor. But even in those moments where infants have to wait, we want to make sure that we are responsive in that waiting period by saying, I'm going to get your bottle, I'll be right there, we're about to change your diaper, so that they are readily able to recognize that their needs are going to be met. This again helps them to feel safe and secure and that sense of attachment. In regards to more independence, by about 18 months, a securely attached child tends to be more willing to try new things and to explore, because her limbic system, and the limbic system is the emotional register of the brain. So that's it's a center of the brain that takes in emotions. And when that limbic system is wired with those emotions, again, the trust is there that they know that if I need help, that my needs are going to be met. Better problem solving. Some researchers have found that a securely attached child tends to be a better problem solver at around age 2 than an insecurely attached child, possibly because she is more willing to try new things and to risk failure in her search for solutions to new problems. Better relationships. We see that they're more successful with friendships. If we go back to that concept that we talked about a few slides ago, about the brain is pattern, it's seeking, so that if the brain has been wired to feel a sense of security, to feel a sense of attachment, then that again is going to play and lay out the template for latter relationships and friendships. A child who is securely attached as an infant will form or tend to form better relationships with other children in preschool and further in life. Research shows that a positive early attachment experience sets up a blueprint, so that's what I was saying by a template, that helps the child better understand how to negotiate later relationships. So all of this really deeply matters in terms of the early experiences that young children may have. It is also important to note that attachment relationships can change over time. So as we said earlier also, that the brain is adaptable. So if an adult learns to be more consistent and nurturing, an insecure attachment may become more secure. If a previously reliable adult becomes unpredictable, a secure attachment may become insecure. So it works both ways. And again, that principle of the brain is pattern seeking. So the consistent experiences that an infant has is what we will see output based on the wiring of the brain once again. Now we're going to move on to continuing to think about those brain basics, but also looking specifically at language acquisition for infants. A few general facts about language, and the brain. We'll begin with understanding that language is a higher order ability that requires sensory input. Learning language is a process that begins at birth and continues throughout the lifespan. Language requires many different skills. Receptive language, which is the ability to understand, develops before expressive or productive language, which is the ability to speak. An infant too young to speak shows an understanding of language by responding appropriately to verbal questions or directions. So in essence, we know that we can measure and observe that they're understanding what it is that we're saying by the actions that we see them perform. A baby must be able to hear before she develops the connections in the brain to process and produce spoken language. Hearing spoken language helps the brain to make and strengthen language connections. Children who cannot hear will have the sensory experience to understand and produce spoken language without intensive intervention. Children who cannot hear can also learn to communicate through sign language, which we'll talk about in just a minute. But what we want to keep in mind as well is that repetition. That repetition forms language connections within the brain. It is crucial for the development of language. Repeating the same words and phrases, reading the same books regularly, and singing the same songs over and over again provides repeated input that builds and strengthens connections in the language centers of the brain. So the repetition, again, is going to strengthen the connections that are there for spoken language. So that use it or lose it. The more that we're talking to them, the more that we're reading to them, the more that we're reading books to them, we're making those connections strong, which of course we know are very important for several different latter academic skills. We also want to go with the train of thought of repetition being good for social and emotional development as well, in the sense that if we're reading the same books or familiar books and familiar songs, it helps them to experience success because it is something that they are familiar with. They know it. It fosters that feeling of, I can do this. I know this. Even within the infant stage, this is an important part to think about. Now, of course, we're going to introduce new books and new songs and new words, but we want to make sure, again, that repetition is there for several different purposes. Additionally, we want to look at a few different facts that go along with language acquisition, such as the fact that infants who are spoken to often or frequently learn almost 300 more words by age do. Research also suggests that children should hear approximately 30 words a day, and this is all the way through the age of 5. This stems from American Educator and the study of the 30 million word gap, which studied how many words children were exposed to. And they discovered that by age 5, that it's essentially about 30 million words is about the difference. And when they break that down, it's stating or suggesting rather that children hear about 30,000 words a day through spoken language. I want to be clear in saying not knowing, of course, 30,000 words, but hearing 30,000 different words a day. The last point that I have on here is that these numbers provide great information and a basis for us, but it's not the total picture. So it's not so much about counting words, but you want to think about the quality in which the quality of the context in which young children are hearing these words, infants included. So, for example, it's the difference between an infant or a young child just hearing a lot of words, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but we want to think about the quality. So the quality comes from intention. Are they hearing these words from direct conversation? One example that I tend to give with my students in our language and literacy class is that children, infants, adolescents, middle childhood children can hear a lot of words, but are the words put into context through direct engagement and conversation? So you want to ensure that you're having lots of meaningful conversation, lots of descriptive wording that you're using as you converse with infants, that you're talking with them throughout the day and you're talking to them about many different things. This is going to increase the quality of the words that they hear in regards to spoken language versus just hearing words in the background or that adults are around them or caregivers are around them talking, but not necessarily talking directly to them, meaning that they're not actively engaging directly with the infant. So how do we go about some of these is that we want to be intentional. And we really want to think about different strategies, and there are many, of course, that we can think about and that we can use. But we want to, one, go back to what we know in regards to those brain basics and what we know about brain development and what we know about how we should engage and how we should interact with young infants. Because we know that those loving interactions paired with learning language and experience truly will make a difference in the long run for their holistic growth and development. So looking at strategy, helping them to learn language, which in many ways happens quite naturally, but we know that there are some dynamics or techniques that we want to use that really are helpful and gainful for young infants. One is using infant-directed speech. Many of you probably have heard of motherese, or the term now is called parentese to include fathers, which is really quite accurate because it's not just females or mothers, but it's everyone that seems to naturally, for the most part, when they get around infants, our voices change. Our pitch goes higher, we start to talk lower, we start to talk in a sing-song type of pattern, and this is all good for young children. Understand, that infant-directed speech is not the same thing as baby talk. Baby talk is really nonsense, they're not real words, you can't really understand, there's no meaning of what you are saying. That is baby talk. Here we're talking specifically again about infant-directed speech that is beneficial for them. And in just a moment I'd like to show you a clip that I share with my class that shows parentese or infant-directed speech in use. So let's actually take a look at that, and I'll come back to the other two. The website that we're going to go to is Parenting Counts, which is a great website that I highly recommend that has lots of information on all domains of learning and developmental characteristics. When you go to the website, there's a developmental timeline. And included in that developmental timeline, there are videos that you can watch. One thing that I can appreciate about them as well is that they're to the point and short, which is a nice feature to sometimes have. Having a little bit of difficulty with the link coming up, so just bear with me for a moment, please. I'm going to try to get to it a different way. Not having success, bear with me. If not, I may just have to skip it and I'll give you the website information for you to hopefully look at it on your own at your convenience. Try one more time here. Okay, it doesn't look like I'm going to have success with opening this right now. That's okay. At the end, I'm writing down a note to give you the website. But it's just a short video clip that shows a father with his buddies on a typical Saturday or Sunday afternoon watching a basketball game. And a great burly man, probably about 6'5" or so, and the baby is there, and the baby starts to cry, and he gets up, and he starts talking to the infant and being responsive and using parentese, and his buddies are kind of looking at him like, what's up with that? Why is he using that voice? Why is he singing to his baby? But mostly it's a little bit unexpected, but a very positive thing that we want to see with young, happening with parents, caregivers, and adults alike with infants. So it's really a great example and a little comical to watch as well. But one thing too that was illustrated in that video clip that I haven't mentioned is the exaggerated rhythms. So we want to use what we a lot of times that pause and punch of, we don't want words to be too slow for infants. We want them to know that they go together, but we want to drag them out just a little bit so that they realize, and they can, well, not realize, more so can hear those sounds. So for example, when we're saying hello, that they can hear the sounds within that word, that we're using rhythms to punch, to give a little bit of pause and punch, which essentially is helping them to hear the rhythm, the beat, which we know leads into the syllables of words. Of course, that's not a skill that we would expect from infants, but it starts very early on, again, from their experiences and the way that they hear language. You see repetition again, which we talked about earlier, which again will add into that wiring process and their ability to make connections, and then also turn-taking. So in your conversation with them, you want to make sure that that is present with all of your interactions with infants. High quality books is something that we want to talk about as well. I would like to think in this day and age that pretty much anybody can write a book. And I think many of you would agree with that. With that being said, we have to go with understanding that all books that are published don't necessarily belong in our classrooms or in the hands of our young infants. Now, of course, some books or any books would be better than no books, but we're here for a higher level of quality and intentionality. So with high quality books that you're providing for young children, you want to think about a few different attributes, and they are listed here. One, do they have appropriate vocabulary? Is it vocabulary that we would deem or recognize helpful and supportive for infants at their stage of development? Also, does it have clear illustrations? So remember that through the exposure with the books, they are making connections between what they hear and what they see. And sometimes what we find in children's books is that they might have great illustrations, but they may not have great vocabulary. You want to make sure that they have both. And in considering those two, you also want to make sure that the text and illustrations are synchronized. So for example, you want to make sure that each page within the book, and typically if you start to see it in the beginning, you will usually see it throughout. But this is something to think about. Are they synchronized? Do they go together? If the text is saying that the little boy is throwing a ball, is that actually happening? And sometimes you will find in some children's books that that does not always occur. So that is something that you want to check for, and it is a hallmark of high quality books. Again, repetitive phrases. So repetition is something that we keep coming back to. Again, for the wiring process that happens within the brain, but then also that social and emotional piece of, I know what to expect, I know what's coming, I know this part. And then you also want to think about opportunities for sensory engagement, which is very common in many quality books that are designed for infants. A lot of times within board books, we'll see this with young children, that there's something that they can touch and that they can feel. You also want to think about the types of books that you are reading. Now, you could really read anything to infants, of course. That's still exposure to language, but you want to make sure that you are exposing them to books and concepts and genres that they can relate to, and that are going to foster their development as well. So for example, here we have You Are My Sunshine and I Love You, Good Night. So reading books before they go to bed, for example, before they take a nap, things that are naturally a part of their life and their daily routines are great to use, and typically they're very responsive because it is something that they can relate to. And it also will help to foster that bonding and sense of attachment, especially when using those books that are of a social and emotional genre. Here is another example, excuse me, of a high quality book that can be used with infants, Deep Sea Dive. So notice also that it's simple, right? If you see right there on the left with sea turtle in the picture, it's clear, but yet it's stimulating for young children. Over here, there's simple text for you to read, yet the illustration is quite simple of the jellyfish as well. This is also a flip-up book, so while they may not, and probably depending on what age within infancy they are, may not be able to flip the book on their own, but that provides sensory engagement as well, and also supports their cognitive skills of how things work and what they do, and providing interesting and novel experiences for young children. Another example is this book, Wacky Wild Peekaboo. When we talk about sensory engagement, things that children can, or infants, excuse me, touch and feel. On the cover of this book where it says boo, those are actually velvet letters. So with an infant, you can spend a few minutes just on this page alone, giving them the opportunity to touch, to feel, and to look. One thing that I also want you to pay attention to is the coloring. Children and infants, of course, we want to expose them to lots of color, and that will happen quite naturally through the environment. But we also want to think about developmental characteristics as well. For a young infant, black and white patterns is a pattern that is visually preferred, for them. One being also the human face, but then also colors such as red and yellow. I'm certainly not suggesting that all the books that you expose them to are in black and white, but we do want to think about ensuring that we have lots within our environment that is of the black and white pattern as for our younger infants. So we're talking about between about birth to about 3 to 4 months that would be something that you would look to focus on in terms of, not focus so much, but ensure that you are including within your infant environment. Our next slide brings us to the strategy of course, reading to infants. A few pointers with this one is to read when relaxed, and we also want them to have a positive association with times that they are being read to and that they have with books. So of course this is best when they're relaxed, but also keep in mind that when you're relaxed as well, making sure that you are within the correct disposition for reading the story. When reading, you want to use varied voices. This will help them to hear, again, the sounds of language. It engages them in wordplay by hearing the different pitches within your voice. And as I tell my students with the voices, go for it and don't take yourself so seriously. Sometimes they might hold back a little bit for being afraid of how they might sound or how they might look. But what's more important, of course, is to have a good time as you're reading with your infants. And again, not to take yourself so seriously, as there's lots of benefits that they get from us when we do those voices and sometimes silly faces and all of those things. Again, you want to exaggerate words and phrases, which we saw on a previous slide, and you want to give infants a chance to respond. So earlier when we talked about that turn-taking piece, that applies here as well. So when we're reading the book, as we're flipping the pages, we want to make sure that we're giving the opportunity for infants to respond, and a lot of times that's physically. Sometimes it's through a gesture. Sometimes it's just pausing and waiting and giving them the opportunity to actually just take in what's on the page. So let them lead. And again, it shows the art of turn-taking, of your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn. Our next strategy is infant signing. Signing, there are lots of benefits to this. And many of you probably or hopefully do this with the infants that you work with or within your home. But it is a form of communication that really can spark critical thinking. But in addition, it's also symbolic thinking, that they're taking a gesture and using that as a symbol. And we know that symbolic thinking is a critical skill. As much of what they will do in their latter academic experiences is based upon symbols, such as math and reading, for example. As we know, it also alleviates stress, and it gives them a way to be expressive, that they know the words, they know what they want to say, but they're not yet able to produce them. Research also suggests that there's a correlation between the number of gestures and later vocabulary. It doesn't necessarily mean that that infant will later be smarter. Again, it just means that they may have a greater vocabulary, that might be a stronger skill set. And that goes back to brain wiring as well, that experience was there for them very early on. There's a wonderful website that I'd like to recommend. It's babysignlanguage.com. Let's see if I can get this one in for us to take a glance at. Okay, yes, we are in. There's a video, an intro video that's great to look at in terms of what are some of the benefits of using sign language with infants. But there's also a dictionary that you can use and free principles that you can use as well. If you go to the dictionary and say you want to teach them hello, you would click on it. And one, it's going to show you how to do hello. Hello. A little salute. Hello. So we'll show you how to do hello, and then there's a principle for you as well that you can print these out for your classrooms or for you to use if it's your classroom or your home environment, whatever context that may be. And as you can see, there's a plethora of words and vocabulary that you can use that are available for you. These are free, which is always a nice thing when we have a resource that we can access that is beneficial and also cost-effective for us to use as well. So please go back. I hope you guys will go out and go back and check out that website, babysignlanguage.com. A few different games or engagement strategies that you can use, and I would like to share with you in our last few moments together. One is Talk to Me, which is something really that I've already discussed as we've moved through the previous content. But one is about holding conversations with infants all day long, getting in the habit of having a conversation. So when we talked about having quality exposure, quality conversation, quality exposure to words for young children, we want to talk to them about things that are happening all day. When we're changing their diapers, when we are feeding them, when we're engaging in tummy time, and we want to have a conversation about what they're doing, what they're seeing at that time. These are all very beneficial, and they promote and support brain and language development, and they support the holistic development of an infant as well. In regards to brain development and language development, we know that that experience wires them for language. Hearing you talk and letting them respond makes needed connections in their brain. It helps them to develop their own language. Remember, it comes from experience. So we want to keep that in mind as we engage in meaningful conversation with infants. The next one is mirror, mirror. With mirror, mirror, you want to think of imitating, right? Imitation is the basis for most human learning. So here you can make funny faces and sounds for infants to observe, and then it's important to watch them as they try to imitate you. And you also want to go back to that turn taking of letting the infant lead the way too. So it's that they're trying to imitate your faces, and we want to give them the opportunity that when we see them making different faces, that we mirror that back to them as well. Another strategy that we have is how I'm feeling. This relies on imitation as well. Is that what you want to do is match your reactions, match your feelings to the emotions that the infant is expressing. So if they are expressing, let's say, a feeling of frustration or a feeling of sadness, we want to say, oh, you're feeling sad, or you're a little bit frustrated right now. And then we want to comfort them, of course, by being physically and emotionally responsive to their needs. When they're feeling excited, we want to say, oh, you're feeling excited right now. When you tune into their emotions and respond to what they need, it helps them to make connections, very important connections, in the emotional part of their brain. One, because you're responding, and then two, in terms of language and interactions that, again, I know I've said it a lot of times, that wiring process is going to be there for them as they make connections between what they're feeling in what it is that you're saying through your engagement with them. Another one is texture time that we want to think about with young children. Earlier we touched a little bit on sensory input, that we know that the senses are a primary way of learning, especially for infants and for young children. And we want to intentionally, we want to go out of our way to make sure that we're providing lots of opportunity for infants to explore different textures in many different places. And I want you to think about, through this exposure with young children and infants in particular, is safety, of course, health and safety will always be a primary concern. But we want to work with based on the premise of as safe as possible, and the difference between as safe as possible and as safe as necessary. We take many different precautions when working with infants and young children, many of which are mandated and mandated for a very good reason. But we also want to think sometimes we're a little bit too precautionary, if you will, meaning that some experiences that could be quite appropriate for infants are not provided because we're working from as safe as possible of, oh, we can't do that, oh, that won't be safe. But think it through. Sometimes it can be safe for infants and for young children. So again, how can you make it as safe as necessary for the child so that we are exposing them again to a variety of textures and experiences that are going to promote the wiring of the brain. It's going to promote language development. When we say, oh, that feels bumpy, that feels rough, that feels smooth, that's going to, again, make those connections between what they're doing and what they're feeling and what they are seeing at the same time. That it puts it all together for them and really creates a high-quality learning experience for young children. Our time at this point actually is almost about up, but we've gone through several, I don't know that it's several, but we've had a chance to go through a few different strategies that you can use. And of course, most of these are very open-ended. So it's there for you to tailor it and to make it your own. But when we really look at this, basically it boils down to coming back to those brain development principles and developmental characteristics of what we know about infants to really, one, support their brain development, but also to support their language development skills as well along the way in a fun and playful, but yet very purposeful way for infants, so that we're not under-challenging them, or as some would say, it's a little bit underwhelming. So what can we really do to enrich and enhance those experiences for our infants to help them in the here and now, but also, again, to lay that blueprint for future learning for infants. So through this snapshot, I would like to call it, that we've had over the last hour or so, we've talked about three different things. We've talked about the relationship between brain development and language acquisition. We've identified how intentional language engagement will support their holistic development, so that we're thinking about the brain, we're thinking about the language, but we know that it will affect their physical skills, it will affect their social-emotional skills and their cognitive skills as well. And we've looked at a few strategies to actively engage infants in meaningful language experiences, where again, a lot of this is happening quite naturally, but it also is only going to be enhanced when we intentionally plan for them as well. At this point, there's some information that will be forthcoming about certificates. Also, if there are any questions, we don't really have a lot of time. Unfortunately, we're almost at our 12 o'clock mark to answer a lot of questions. However, if there are any questions feel free to put them in the chat box, and between Diane and I, we will do our best to answer those for you. I also want to remind you of the websites. Here are some of the sources that were used today. I also want to point out those websites, one, the babysignlanguage.com that you'll see right here, and of course our Better Brains for Babies website is one that I would highly recommend as well. The one that is not on here that has the clip about the parentees, that website is parentingcounts.org, and I am actually going to put that into the chat box on the side there. But again, I recommend that. That has lots of resources. One, the developmental milestones, but then those wonderful video clips that are just short clips, 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes, that show what these skills look like in action. Lastly, before I turn it back over to Diane, I would just like to say thank you for joining us today. I hope you're walking away with some inspiration, some new knowledge, something that will continue to empower you to be a high-quality, effective educator and caregiver for our infants and children. So thank you, and again, you can make a difference. That is proven, and we know it, and we appreciate your commitment to that, to doing so. Thanks
so much, Sharon, for being here and for sharing that information with us. We appreciate your time, and yes, I see the question about where the slides will be available. Let me share that link one more time, and we will make sure that these slides are available, as well as a recording of this webinar. So if you know someone who wants to get the information but wasn't able to attend today, you'll be able to get that information there.